more than Gina just did. We are being recorded. We will just start with introducing ourselves, and then a little bit of the agenda today is we'll just answer a few questions panel style. I'll facilitate and I'll jump in as well, and then we'll have some activities for the group and we'll have a closing. So if the panelists could start, but I think everyone, since we have a small group, could actually introduce themselves, say your name, pronouns, what department you work in, and what made you want to sign up for today's workshop. So my name is Delmar Douala. I work in the SEEK department. We support low-income college students with admission. It's an opportunity program. I support them all throughout their journey. So I'm an academic counselor, and I teach ED 100, a freshman seminar class. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I just want to figure out ways to have difficult conversations, support our students, and build safer spaces. I know even that term can be complicated. So I'm really excited, and I'll pass it over to Sky.
Thank you, Delmar. My name is Sky. My pronouns are she and her. I am an adjunct professor here in the sociology department, dispute resolution department. I am also a mediator, conflict coach, and restorative justice advocate. And I think I'll stop. Oh, I also teach dispute resolution classes, and I'm currently this semester for spring teaching a restorative justice class. And I think what brings me to this work is supporting communities, having hard conversations, but also holding their self-determination, meaning making sure they're able to and want to have the conversations. So thank you, and I'm going to pass to Alessandra.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Alessandra Early. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice. Why am I here? Well, my general research interests revolve around identity formation, behavior, and also spaces, in particular social spaces. And so I view most environments we're in as a social space if there are people involved. And in particular, my work has looked at the ways in which social spaces and space in general on one side might appear to be safe. So in particular, my work looks at queer social spaces. So we have this idea that queer spaces are supposed to be inherently safe for queer people. But then what happens when there are different kinds of disruptors in there? So in terms of like racialization that happens in these spaces and the ways in which identity can sometimes make those spaces not as safe as they appear to be. So this is just right up my alley. I love talking about space. So I'm just very excited to be here. I'm going to pass it on to Dora.
I think she went for a quick phone call.
All right. Well, Noam, do you wanna hop in?
Okay. Hi, my name is Noam. Good to see you, everyone. My pronouns is he, him, his, and I'm from the LPS department and also in the International Criminal Justice Program. I started this fall in John Jay and very excited to be here. And I'm teaching empirical research. I will pass it to Talisha. I hope I said the name correctly.
Hello, hi. My name is Talisha, and I'm a SEEK counselor, also a peer mentor coordinator. And can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So yeah, I'm Talisha, and I'm here in the SEEK department, and I'm happy to be here with you all. Did I miss a prompt?
Your pronouns, Talisha?
My pronouns, she, her, and hers.
Thank you. And we have Dora in the chat. Dora put, may need to step out for a quick call. I'm Dora Mendez, adjunct in PAD, also an MPA alum, class of 2010 for about 13 years, and I'm a chief DEI officer, so safe spaces is best practices. Thank you. And if anyone needs to just use the chat, that is totally fine. I know a few people just joined, so we're just doing introductions right now, your name, pronouns, department, and what made you join today. And I will pass it to Tracy, and then you can call on and we can help with the people who haven't been here.
Good morning. My name is Tracy Myers. I am a doctoral lecturer in the SEEK department. I am here because I would say my research, my work, my passion is all about identifying and overcoming barriers for BIPOC community and disenfranchised communities to access health and mental health services. So safe spaces are very important, reducing stigma, having people be able to speak and tell their truths and share. And so that's why I'm here. And of course, supporting my fellow Sikh folks.
Sikh is represented today. Thank you, Tracy. And Ma'a, I believe, is the last person.
Greetings. My name is Ma'at Lewis. I'm a faculty in the Department of Counseling and Human Services, and I'm actually serving temporarily on the Sikh PMB this year. And I'm here because the topic is important to me, and probably more so because of my respect and value for the Sikh faculty. I saw Delmar, and having the opportunity to join you in community seems important.
Come on, thank you, everyone. So basically, this is a Sikh meeting, if you didn't know, with a few extra people. But thank you. I think we have so much knowledge in the room, so it'll be exciting to hear from everyone. And we'll have some interactive activities as we go through our agenda. But I guess the first question, which I know we touched on somewhat, that I want to ask the other panelists is, why is it important to have conversation on safe spaces in the classroom right now? I think it's always important to have these conversations, but it feels like things are heightened and polarized, and we know so much is going on in our social, economic, and political climate. And I'll pass it to Alessandra.
Yes. Okay, I'm just pulling my notes up here. I like to have my little notes with me. So when we were getting started putting this panel, Delmar actually sent around a bunch of questions that were fantastic. And so you'll kind of hear why we're all kind of answering kind of similarly in terms of the questions that we're going to talk about. But the first question we were thinking about was like, why is it important to have this conversation on a safe space or on a safe space in classrooms right now? I think that it feels more heightened right now because of what's going on in the state of the world. We've got war in the Middle East. We've got the pending election coming up, all sorts of attacks on academia, freedom of speech. And our students, you know, if we can also think about what it's like to be a student. I mean, I recently just graduated, so it's a little fresh for me right now. But I feel like this has always been a topic of conversation. And in particular, if you come from a background like myself with multiple identities that intersect and are marginalized, being safe in a classroom has always been paramount. I think the ways in which how we show up in the classroom for our students, how our students show up, how we don't show up sometimes, in particular, can also impact this creation of a safe space. So in my mind, when I'm thinking about like, what does a safe space look like? I think about what does safety in a classroom look like? I think about an environment where students and instructors feel emotionally, physically, psychologically as safe as possible. And the only reason why I say it's possible is because I tend to think that it's hard or very difficult to erase all kind of discomfort in the classroom, in particular, if you're teaching along the intersections of like race, gender, class, which is what I typically teach on. It's very difficult for people to not feel some discomfort in the classroom, and even for an instructor to not feel discomfort. So like, for example, this semester I'm teaching race, crime, and justice. Well, it's race, gender, crime, ethnicity, and justice. For the first time, I've never taught a race course before. I'm a little nervous, in particular because race, especially right now, as I've mentioned with the pending election and in the past, is a really hot button topic. It's stressful for teachers, for me, for students as well. And I also think that it's important to understand that our classrooms can be an opportunity for us and for students to have this dedicated time to feel safe, largely because we don't know what's going on sometimes in our students' lives. I know now, having spent a semester here and talking to some of my students, a lot of our students are housing insecure. A lot of our students are food insecure. A lot of our students are financially insecure, working a couple jobs, have caregiving responsibilities, have children, have older adults, all the while trying to go to school. So this classroom, the 75 minutes we have, or depending on how long your class is, that might be the one time where students feel safe or feel comfortable even having conversation, even asking, what does race mean? What does ethnicity mean? What's going on? Like, how do I fit into this world? So I feel like right now it just feels a little bit more heightened to have these conversations, but I think that this has always been an important topic. Anybody else want to jump in from the panel?
Yes, thank you, Alexandra. What I was going to say for this question, to answer this question, honestly, really stems from the work that I do as a mediator and a restorative justice practitioner. One of the ways that I create a safe space is through community building, bringing the group of people I'm working with together. And usually I do that with circles, to be honest with you. And I don't know other way to answer it, but that's really the truth. Every semester, because I teach a dispute resolution course and a restorative justice course, but mainly dispute resolution courses, I use that in the beginning of my class, the semester, but I keep it going through. So what it means is, which I have found interesting, students really get to know each other in a different way, in the way I structure who, first of all, finding out who's in the room with you, right? And knowing that there's going to be different views and understandings of where people are coming from and why they believe what they believe. But giving that opportunity for them to talk, not just around, and maybe it's also because of the topic that I teach, conflict, right? Or conflict management or engagement, however you want to mention it, or however you want to phrase it. The way I look at bringing and having those conversations is by grounding us in knowing who's in the room, really knowing you, not just you sit in front of me and if you don't come, then she's going to see me because I'm in the back. But like, who's next to you? Who's in front of you? Where are we coming from? And of course, I just want to say this. As a restorative justice practitioner, it's true, not everyone feels safe at first, but I tell you, by the end of the semester, really engaging in a different way, and that's where I'm leading from with this answer, students do definitely get more comfortable and share more. So my answer to this is the way we engage them in the beginning and throughout, because let's face it, I've experienced and I know there are hard topics and hard feelings around certain things, or personal feelings around things that people do not want to explore with each other in certain close spaces. But I think if we make the space and we don't push off, if that makes sense, like, oh, we can't talk about that, then we're opening them up to have those conversations. And I'm going to pass it to Delmar.
Yeah, and Sky, thank you for that. Thank you both. And I'm not gonna go in order with these questions because
Sure.
I think hearing you speak, it made me think of the question that we have about tips and how do we build these like safer spaces, and it may not be safe for everyone, as you were, sharing, Alessandra, and we're speaking across identities, so it's difficult to have many of these conversations. And you talked about circles, so I know everyone structures their classes different, but something I do in Seek is using group development and group work skills to have conversations and to build community. So having the students sit in a circle, depending on your class, that might not work, and depending on the structure of the class and what class you get in the new building or here and all. But if there's a way we can see everyone, build community, use icebreakers. I know some people do this and it can sometimes feel arbitrary, but like community guidelines, community norms, group norms, because we know conflict is going to emerge in any space, whether it's classroom and department meetings, in our relationships, we're interacting with people. So conflict is going to happen, and not all conflict is bad. And I'm going to try not to go on tangents, but because people are overwhelmed and things are more heightened, people project, right? So it might not even be the conversation that we're having, but people are bringing their pain, they're bringing their stress, they're bringing their frustration into conversations that can be complicated. So having people sit in circles, community building, community norms. I don't know if anyone's done I know Maat, I believe, is a Undoing Racism workshop facilitator, or you've been involved with them, Maat?
More of a participant than a
Participant, okay, okay. But one of the group norms I remember from them years ago, one of them was expect and accept the lack of closure. And, having a conversation around racism, and that's a 3-day workshop. There's no way we're going to get to everything. So that, for me, is something I like to bring in all the groups that I run, because it's like when things are coming up and when things feel like they're not completed or fully addressed, bringing back some of those community agreements. Like, you remember when we said accept and expect the lack of closure? Of course, having all the students go around and share some kind of community agreements that they think is important, a norm, one mic, having one person speak at a time. And of course, there's so many different things that can come up, but to have that conversation early on and talk about conflict, talk about the state of the world, talk about all these things that are going on in the beginning of the class, because we know things are going to emerge, and sometimes we're overwhelmed trying to have certain conversations, and we haven't done that work with building the community, having a restorative space, and being comfortable with conflict. Everyone's not going to feel comfortable. We're talking about things across identities and privilege and marginalized identities. So it's difficult to engage in any of these conversations, some of the things we've already talked about. So I'll pass it to Alexandra, and you can add on more, Sky, just tips that you have to build a safer classroom space and to have these conversations.
Sure, yeah. So I do usually the first day of class, I do a little housekeeping, and I also do this kind of group agreement activity where we all kind of, I describe what group agreements are, classroom agreements, And I really use them as a way to help set the guidelines for the class in terms of like, how do we want to engage with each other? So if you feel like someone is saying something negative towards you, how do you want me to respond? And how do you want to respond to each other? And then I make sure that we hold ourselves accountable. So what does accountability look like? So if someone interrupts you when you're talking, is that something you want me to say? Like, hey, let's give someone a chance to talk. Or is it something that you want to handle directly? I have found that to be useful. I've also found this kind of notion between calling in and calling out, which we will have an activity about that a little bit later. But this idea, trying to find the balance between when do you call somebody out for saying something versus when do you call someone in. And I find calling in is a much more effective way to kind of reshift the tensions that might be in the classroom, and also acknowledge that we're all humans, right? I'm a human, they're humans, we make mistakes. I think that if we call in our students rather than we call them out more often, we give them opportunities to kind of sit with that discomfort rather than run away from it. I also use vulnerability and humor a lot in my classroom. I like to think of myself as funny. I don't know. You can tell me maybe at the end of this panel. Although I am in professional mode, so I might not be as funny as normal. But generally, I use humor a lot of times in classrooms to kind of break up tension, whether it's through pop cultural videos and stuff like that, or whether it's just me being my normal uncomfortable self. I also share a lot of myself in classroom in terms of vulnerability. So usually within the first month or so, I out myself to my students, largely because there have been instances where as a student myself, I don't see myself represented in a classroom or a syllabus, and then I don't feel like that environment's safe. And so if I understand that I had felt that way as a student, I assume that my students feel that way as well. And so I usually, out myself. And so then there have been several instances where I've had students who are queer come up to me and say, I've never had a queer person of color like you in a classroom before. And just you being up there, even though I wasn't this student said that, even though I wasn't remotely interested in the class or the class material, just seeing you up there made me feel like I wanted to come to class. I wanted to learn because I wanted to have those engagements with you. So even like small things, like putting yourself in the classroom, like dropping the facade almost of being this kind of sanitized professor, I think can also be a way for students to be more comfortable and see you as a human, see each other as humans. Sky?
Thank you. I really love what you said because I think I'm funny too, and I try to do that, but they're like, no, lady, that's not funny. But it's okay. At least it gets them giggling a little bit. What I was gonna say though is the tips that have already been mentioned are things I use in my class. But what I noticed, and I learned this honestly with my virtual classes, is the power of the breakout, believe it or not. I am so, and Gina knows this because I took one of the sessions many semesters ago. I was like, I can't do anything on Zoom. I just want to keep me, teaching, just talking. But the breakout on Zoom is good, but I've been doing it in class, meaning having students like pair off to do certain activities and not for long. But that is really, I've noticed, kind of open people up to like, I don't agree with you. But we've just had a little moment here talking about this topic. So now I know something more about you. So I really do believe in making opportunities in the classroom where students have an opportunity to engage with each other more and not just the person who's always next to me, if that makes sense, through the whole, let's get up, let's move around, let's talk deeply, especially the course on dispute resolution that I'm teaching. That is, we make it personal. And I think making it personal, meaning like, how do you deal with conflict? And hearing other people, some people connect when they start talking about that. And some people are like, oh, I don't do that. But I guess I'm mentioning this as a tip of basically getting the students more engaged with each other, not maybe the whole time, but a little bit. That also helps to me to create a safe space of, first of all, being vulnerable, to see like, well, who's out there and what are they thinking? And maybe I don't agree with you, but now that I've spent time with you over a period of time, I may not really want to share with you how I really, really feel, but I'm starting to share with you how I feel. And I've seen that happen. I've seen students guarded because politics or beliefs feel a little like, I don't know if I can engage with you. But as they get to know each other a little bit more, they'll at least listen to each other, if that makes sense. And that's something I think is helpful, making time for the students to engage through lesson plan, hopefully, right? So that they get to know who else is with them, who their community is. I look at each semester, I always joke, I say, oh, this is the cohort or the community of spring 2023, and they laugh, they're like, that's not funny. I'm like, but we are, right? So that keeps a little bit of idea of community going, not really to their heart, but you know what I mean, so that they can come back and do it together, this class. Delmar, or anyone else who wants
Yeah,
to
thank
share?
you. And to add one more tip, and you talked about the circle. When there are challenging moments and you can feel the temperature rising, a good activity that I've done in class and in groups is have everyone just share one word about how they're feeling, because then you get every single person in the room to share. And we know with groups, it doesn't matter what the group is, there will be people who are more vocal or any class, and there will be people, students and people who won't share unless you have everyone go around the entire semester. So it's just helpful to do that early on and as consistently as possible. But just giving everyone a second to share any word, positive or negative, really helps us bring the temperature down, see how people are feeling, and come back to the conversation. I think is something that's very helpful. And like you said, using circle as much as possible. Now, speaking of temperature going up, can you all think of a moment where you had a difficult experience in a classroom while you were facilitating, or a conversation that was challenging? I'll start. I remember I teach education and justice, so we were talking about LGBT youth in education, and the conversation started well, and then it just really took a turn where a student started sharing she feels like gay men try to be women and are very flamboyant, and then that one comment led to so many students jumping on and agreeing, and I felt like it was one of those conversations where I kind of lost reins of the class and trying to bring us back, but I was like, you know what, don't know if that's happening today. And in the moment I was trying, as they were sharing, religious beliefs as well, not to take it personal and to think of myself as a young person and remember when I was, in high school, would you be talking about a student like me? And I just remember feeling like I didn't necessarily have control and wasn't doing a great job of bringing us back and wasn't having everyone go around and wasn't asking everyone one word, at least not until the end of the class. And something that just supported me with that experience was speaking with some of my colleagues in SEEK and using the next week to talk about gender roles just in our society and in education. And it felt like we were kind of back on track the next week. And I don't know if other people have felt this way. Oftentimes when I feel like you lose the reins or there's a really difficult class or group, I think because we plan so much for the following week, often in my experience, that week is much better. And maybe because I don't know if it's me or all of us, we put much more effort into the next conversation. But I think sometimes for me, it's been difficult when it can feel personal, even though it's not. And I understand people are young and the way we are socialized to think about what it means to be queer and think about race in these ways. Sandra, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, it's like we've had the same experience, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean, so my area of expertise is gender and sexuality and substance use and spatial identity formations and all that stuff. And so I often, unfortunately, have had situations in which I'll talk about the ways in which gender and sexuality intertwine with the criminal justice system, in particular, the ways that queer and trans communities are over-policed and have all sorts of violence thrust upon them by the criminal justice system. And it's never happened where an entire class has kind of had this kind of emotion or tension or kind of experience. It's usually a handful of people. There was one time I was teaching where I was lecturing about queer criminology, which kind of does this work. And the student, I did say, interrupt me if you have any questions. The student raised their hand and then said that they wanted to read something. And I said, okay. And then they pulled out a Bible app on their phone and proceeded to read part of Genesis to me. It went on for a pretty long time. I didn't really know what to do per se. And I could feel the tension in the room kind of start to build. And so what I did that moment was kind of reorient us back to, the Bible is one text, but it's not an academic text. And in this class, we were kind of looking at academic text as a source of information. So it's a way you kind of want to balance because you don't want to ever invalidate what somebody is saying and what they're trying to advance. But at the same time, you have to kind of reset the boundaries in the class in terms of like what materials are we looking at? Why are these materials included? And why are these materials also not included? And then, I mean, dealing with a conversation like this, especially as a queer person, can be draining because although I'd like to perceive myself to be completely, outside of whatever I'm teaching, we're people, we're invested in this stuff. And there are some kind of emotions tied into teaching, right? And so what I did was find support outside of that classroom. So outside. So if you're not getting the kind of support that you might need in terms of like, you know, you're teaching something and then the students are all excited about it and it's going great, you can find that in your colleagues. So I started working with the Division of Queer Criminology through American Society of Criminology. I found out they've also had similar situations. So I've started networking in terms of figuring out like, okay, how do I present this information? And like, if this happens, what does this look like? Or what do you do when this happens? Or how do you combat this? Or how do you, or maybe combat is such like a violent word, but how do you kind of navigate this situation, that situation? So that's been useful, but it can definitely be very stressful. Sky?
Thank you. It's so funny. The experience I had was with, it wasn't here at John Jay, but it was with a group of adults, and it did have to do with racial dynamics. And I was in a group where it was overly majority, a group, I'll say it was white people and Black people, but the Black people in this particular group were the minority of the group. It was educators, I'll just say that. And we were talking about what does it mean for the students that they are teaching, who happen to be students of color and from different nations and everything. And I remember it was difficult for me because I was facilitating something and it was very hard and I felt very defeated because honestly, what the adults were saying were the same thing, but they weren't really seeing they weren't seeing their coworkers, I'll say, with the students that they were working with. And I bring it up as an example because I too felt drained, but I kind of want to highlight what Alessandra and Delmar said about community. After I left, I was like, I need to talk to somebody because I didn't know what to do. And I do want to say though, in that experience, I didn't back down. I still pushed with what the issues were. And the issues were students didn't feel they were being treated equitably, if that makes sense. And I was there as an in-between in a way, doing a workshop about how we can be more equitable for everybody, right? That they have to work with, meaning the youth. And I remember thinking, oh, maybe I shouldn't have kept my point going, which is what does equity look like for our students that we are there for them sometimes we are their community, just to get to it, right? So we really have to be mindful of how we interact with them. And I remember thinking maybe I shouldn't have went so hard. I'm not gonna lie to y'all, I went hard that day. I was like, I don't want to know about when you were 17. We're talking about 2017 now, right? We can't go back to the 70s and talk about your experience. We have to be in the now. And I remember thinking, even when in those situations, it's good to be mindful of what we're saying and doing, maybe not backing down. I don't know if that sometimes creates safe spaces, but it can, because you want everyone, to me, I feel, at least to feel heard, right? And that is something that was able to be accomplished that day. Everyone did feel heard because I let everybody in that room of 40 talk from their point of view and how they do what they do. And the reason I mentioned the racial dynamic in this situation, because this is the one that comes to mind because it was very difficult and it was for hours, I should say. It wasn't just a class period. It was like a 5-hour session. But I bring it up because I know the possibilities. And I wanted to say this. And to me, the possibilities of having these difficult experiences is just to highlight what's already been said, having outside support, but also not being afraid to kind of stand in what we've created in that space, right? Where everyone's going to be able to talk. You're not going to overpower someone with your point of view. We all get an opportunity. And maybe we may walk away a little funky afterwards, because that definitely happened. But I tell you this, more conversations were happening in that building without me, which is fine. And that was the point, right? The point is for people to see the other side, right? And not just feel like, well, this is my point and I don't care what you have to say about it. I have a point too. I have a view on the situation. And I think it's important that we're supported when we're doing this work, but that we also continue to support communities to have conversation. The last thing I wanted to say that I meant to mention earlier is we should also be open when students in particular feel like they can have the conversation amongst the bigger group. I've had many students over the semesters pull me to the side and say, hey, this is, I feel this way about what came up, or would you mind if I said something? I'm like, absolutely, you can say what you need to say, because one of the things I do believe in is definitely encouraging having a conversation, even if it's hard, and seeing where we are at the end of it, seriously. And I'm very much, this is my conflict engagement self talking now. I believe even when people don't see what you expect them to see in the conversation, a shift happens. I'm all about shift. It's going to be different than it was before you started. There will be a shift in understanding. Maybe they will look at you differently, not in the way you think in a negative way, but like, oh, that's their stance. And I respect it. Even if they don't respect it, they'll understand that's where you're coming from. So sometimes it's always not about the resolution, but the understanding of this is my point of view, and I need you to understand this is my point of view. Delmar?
Mhm. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And when you were speaking, it made me think about having these conversations in mixed company too, when we're talking about these identities being queer, gender, racial, and sometimes it's helpful to have affinity groups. I know that can be difficult depending on which class or if it's a workshop, and then getting together. And just even if you don't do that, acknowledge that it is difficult to have these conversations in mixed company, and it brings up different things for different people. I think it's important just for us to share. I'm gonna pass it on to Alessandra for our calling in and calling out activity.
All right. So we thought it'd be kind of cool to have us do an activity. So Harvard University's Diversity, Inclusion, Belonging Office published a handout that described what calling in versus calling out means. So it has some general definitions, which I can also send that specific handout around as well. But it has general definitions of what it means to call someone in versus calling out. Things that I kind of think about when I think about that, I think of calling out as kind of like like Lost in Space, like danger, Will Robinson, like that. That's like calling out. Danger, there's a red flag on the play, what's going on? Calling in is more of like if you've had those like crosswalks that say like wait, like that. It's like a yellow, like wait a minute, what's going on here? It's more, it kind of feels like calling out, but in a more respectful and approachable, kind of watered down way is the way I think about it. The document also talks about the ways in which calling in versus calling out also impacts people. So calling out is really much of like a stop, and that can be jolting for people. People generally don't like to feel like they're doing something wrong. Nobody likes to feel like I would like to think nobody likes to feel like they've hurt somebody as well. Whereas calling in might be a pause or like a break in the scene. And so that document also has some examples. So we use that document to create two tables, which I'll send around right now. Let me see if I can. Actually, never shared a file before on Zoom, but I think this should be fine. Okay, great. Yes, just sent it. But you'll see that there are two tables here. So you'll see on table one, there's got this the cells that say moving from calling in to calling out. So you want to think about the sentiments invoked by each calling out phrase that's listed in the left-hand column. And then you want to rephrase or rework that calling out phrase so that is now a calling in phrase. It's a little brain exercise. And then you would write that in the right-hand column. So for example, calling out a phrase would be like, how could you say something like that? How could you say something like that? I'm already attributing blame to that person. Versus calling in might be, why do you think you said that? Where is that coming from? So it's still kind of calling out the behavior, but it's not calling out the person. You're calling in the person to discuss that behavior. In table two, you'll see it says moving from calling in to calling out. So you'll want to think about sentiments evoked by each calling in phrase listed on the left-hand side. And then you'll want to rephrase that, rework it into a calling in phrase. So that now it is rephrase or rework that calling in phrase. So that now it is a calling out phrase. So you're going backwards this time. So an example might be if you're calling in someone, what do you think is making you feel uncomfortable about that? Or like about blank. And if I took that sentence and reworked it so it's calling out, it's why did you react like that? Or why are you uncomfortable or something like that? So we're gonna place y'all into breakout rooms. I think Gina might have to place y'all in the breakout rooms so that you can have some time to go over that activity. Panelists, what do you think? Like 10 minutes per breakout group?
10 minutes is good. And I think, do you want to do it all as a group?
Oh, yeah, we could do that too. That's easier.
I'm fine, because we have a small group. I'm okay with us all doing it together.
Sure. Let's see here.
Hi, Dora, welcome.
I've been here the whole
Okay.
time.
And I can put,
I'm in the room with Gina and the echo.
yeah.
She has, and she's been listening intently. It's great.
And I can put some of the calling out phrases in the chat.
Yeah, so with this first phrase, that's not our culture here. Those aren't our values. That's a calling out phrase. What's the overarching sentiment? How would that make somebody feel hearing that?
Disapproval or excluded.
Absolutely.
As if they don't belong.
Ma'at said judged.
Unwanted.
And do we think that those feelings would make people feel safe in a classroom?
Not at all.
No, not at all. Would anyone want to think about ways you could kind of rephrase that into a calling in phrase or rephrase that kind of
Maybe.
sentence?
Maybe you can say something like, can you help me understand what you meant by that? Or like,
Maybe explaining the culture and your values.
And how do we think those two approaches might shift the sentiment? What are the sentiments that are invoked by what Noam said and Felicia said?
Just reducing some of the potential defensiveness, or, the person might experience.
maybe seeking understanding or trying to invite a conversation about shared values.
Yeah. What about this next one? So the phrase for the calling out is, I don't find that funny. Tell me why that's funny to you. What's the overarching sentiment here?
You ask what's the calling, like the calling out, this what you ask?
Yes, yes.
It's very direct. Like it's a confrontation.
How might that phrase reflect the power imbalance already inherent in the classroom? So if an instructor is saying, I don't find that funny, tell me why that's funny to you, how do you think that makes students feel about the dynamics that are already being set up in that classroom?
Yeah, I guess that was going to come to my mind, the power piece, because initially I was stumbling with this a little bit, but it's really the professor is defining the act or the behavior.
How do we think that phrase might be shifted so that it's more of a calling in phrase?
Maybe to say something about humor that can be subjective, because instead of like being too to do a confrontation, like say something like, I didn't quite get it. What is the context behind the joke, or something that will help shift it to a positive place.
Let's see, it's 11:56, so I'm gonna skip around here so we can get to also have ample time for questions. I'm gonna skip down to, let's see, the second to last one on the calling out phrase. I need you to know how your comment just landed on me. This one's a little bit weird because it's kind of the narrative here that is kind of shifting to like first person versus second person. But how do we think that the sentiment kind of manifests here? I need you to know how your comment just landed on me.
It has a evaluative tone.
And it also is, again, if we think about this coming from an instructor, it's I'm attacked or I'm hurt versus there's an overarching kind of maybe tension or maybe there's a trauma that's happening in the classroom, depending on what was said. But now the focus is on me, the professor who has power over your grades and over how this class runs, how I've been impacted personally. Is it possible to shift this one into more of a calling in phrase?
And asking the person how they think people might experience what they said. You know, how do they think it might land, or ways in which it might land in a group?
Yeah, totally. Sky or Delmar, do you want to do the next activity, table 2?
Sure. I was making
know,
sure.
I can also share my screen if that's more helpful.
Either way, I think I have it though.
Can I just
I'm
say
gonna-
something, Sky, before
Sure, sure.
you notice a lot of our rephrasing, there are questions too. And like the sense of curiosity was coming up with the calling in versus calling out.
Thank you, Delmar. Yes, I noticed that also, and I just wanted to say, sometimes calling in can look like a lot of restorative language that we use, you know, like tell me more, or can you tell me more why you felt that way? Or, and I know that may seem kind of funky, like very just simplistic, but sometimes it can literally just be that, right? I didn't like the way you said in class, or it's, you know, getting people to, I guess, speak from the I. I'm sure we're familiar with the I statements, right? That is helpful, at least again, to broaden and open more. I'm looking at it, I'm gonna start with the calling in phrases. So just for clarity, this is a calling in phrase. I'm curious, what was your intention when you said that? Which kind of flows with what we're talking about, right? So we were just looking at calling out phrases. So now we're talking about calling in phrases. And that's kind of a nice segue if you think about it. You just heard what sounds like kind of negative, heavy, right? Or charged. I like to use that term, charged language, or tone, and tone is something. Tone is everything sometimes, right? You can say something in a way that, why did you say that to me, right? Because that's what it feels like. But also want to go over maybe two more phrases or three more phrases, and this is from the perspective of calling in, right? How might the impact of your words or actions differ from your intent, right? So again, we're hearing things are coming at us, but we're responding in a different way, right? Or my favorite, this is definitely used, how might someone else see this differently? Is it possible that someone else might misinterpret your words and actions? That's another really good calling in phrase. And I think that one's really good because that can happen in the classroom, obviously among students, you with professor with students, but also just personally, right? In your normal life. I think it's important to kind of highlight the calling in. I believe calling in phrases really do kind of foster more communication than pushing away. It's 12:01. I didn't mean to speed through that, guys, but it's 12:01, and I know we said we wanted to make space for questions or conversation. Delmar or Alexandra, do you want to add anything else to calling in phrases before we start taking questions?
Yeah, I wanna maybe ask everyone, can you all think of one word about how you feel just hearing the calling in phrases? And you can unmute and share or drop it in the chat. Maybe, yeah, take a couple seconds, think about what word that comes to your mind about how you feel with the calling in phrases. The words we have in the chat: reflective. Cassandra was thinking the same thing. Hope, valued, respect, curiosity, and encouraged included. So, of course, that's our goal. We want students to always feel that way, our communities to feel this way. We don't always accomplish that, but I think having this framework of calling in all our spaces just creates a shift. And remembering, even when the conflict emerges or there's discomfort or things, you lose the reins of the class, getting back there is always possible. I think, like you were saying, Sky, focusing on the shift that can happen and being comfortable with things that emerge, and also being reflective with our feedback too, when we aren't doing what we maybe need to be doing, or if we take things personal, or we are engaging in calling out behaviors in any of our spaces too. Any questions or comments or things that are coming up for you? How are you feeling about the semester starting soon, and anything that's on your mind?
I'm certainly feeling inspired and ever reflective, I guess. I don't know, useful, helpful as a professor. I think I am. Like, coming to these discussions just keep me reminded, like, this is constant work and constantly important for me to continue to change and revise and tweak. So I'm feeling good and appreciative.
I'm feeling very hopeful and like reassured to just continue these practices and creating safe spaces in the groups that we work within and with. So I'm feeling hopeful and positive.
Sure.
I'm wondering, do any of y'all have any tips or tricks that we haven't discussed that you would feel comfortable sharing?
Well, I like to share something I didn't get a chance to before, but on my syllabus, I include the link of John Jay's racially inclusive policy. And I find that students really appreciate that. So they know on the onset that that's the tone I'm going to set. And I only recall one time getting pushback from someone who was like, what if I don't agree with that? And I said, okay, that's fine. We'll work through it. We'll go each week, and you'll see what the tools are, and you will give feedback. And that has been helpful to me.
Thank you, Noah.
A couple of things that I took notes on as you all were speaking that I wanted to ask questions. So I think this was Alessandra. I had this question that, can you discuss your thoughts about, and this is for all of you, but it came up, I think, when Alessandra was speaking. And please tell me how you say your name right. Alessandra? I'm phonetically challenged.
Yes, Alessandra.
So can you discuss thoughts about distinctions that you might make between the concept of discomfort versus safety in the class? Because sometimes, like, discomfort is good, right? Because some people got attitudes that they need to get uncomfortable about, and they experience a little bit of discomfort in order for the growth to occur. Thinking of it in that way. So just any thoughts about that distinction?
I think the first thing that comes to my mind, so I was a TA for a study abroad trip to South Africa in my master's program right before I went to my PhD. And before we went there, I had a conversation with the professor who was running the trip. And we were just talking about, general pitfalls that she experienced before when she'd run the trip. And one of the situations she had was, so the population of Northeastern University is primarily white, it's primarily upper class. And they took like a primarily group of students. She took a primarily group of students, white upper class students, to South Africa to talk about the ways in which the apartheid and the post-apartheid structure still exists and how it still structures people's everyday existence. And so she took them to a site where a massacre had happened, where a bunch of primarily Black miners had been massacred for protesting and for advocating for themselves. And so after the end of that one excursion, the students gave her a bunch of feedback, and they all said that they felt unsafe, they felt triggered, and they felt all this kind of discomfort that she was talking about. And so she had to find a way to kind of explain and acknowledge the fact that going to this environment and talking about this thing, yes, it is upsetting, it is discomforting for anybody, well, generally for most people, right? But they couldn't, but she also was trying to balance the fact that because these students didn't have any kind of relationship to South Africa, to this experience, to this particular trauma, that they couldn't just hide themselves from it, and they couldn't just not engage with it simply because it was upsetting. And so I heard that, and I thought about that, and I thought about the ways in which I teach in my classroom, and in particular when I especially talk about queer criminology, and sometimes that kind of presents challenging situations for students, in particular when we talk about the ways in which gender and sexuality are socially constructed and kind of diverge from biological approaches. I always tell my students that they're going to feel discomfort at some point in the semester, and that discomfort is not, it's not like you are in danger. You yourself are not in danger. Your physical self, you are not in danger. What is the danger there, or what the discomfort there is, the fact that whatever you're hearing, whatever you're engaging with now is different or divergent or maybe completely opposite from what you're generally used to talking about or how you're generally used to thinking about things. And so I feel like sometimes safety and discomfort get conflated. And in particular, when people's original people's thoughts or ways of thinking or values become well, not politicized, but like put on the spot or maybe challenged in some way, I think sometimes students conflate safety with discomfort. And so really, I try my best to walk this line and telling them that this classroom is, you can feel safe to have questions, to ask questions. Ask me. I am the person that you should ask these questions to. And that's okay. But if you are not engaging with the material or the subject matter is simply because you're feeling discomfort, then that's where we have kind of not an issue, I want to say, but that's when we have a little more working and a little more hand-holding that I might have to do, which is okay, because that happens. I assume at some point all of us have felt some sort of discomfort in a classroom, whether that's us as a professor educating something, and now it's like, oh, I feel uncomfortable talking about this because of the reactions I'm having with my students, or you yourself are students and have felt like, oh, this is not how I thought about this subject, and now I'm like kind of having like this danger siren going off in my head. So that's some thoughts that came to my mind when you just mentioned that, and I hope that helps. Anybody else want to jump in?
Delmar, do you want to go? Because I have a little, well, I'll go briefly. I just want to kind of piggyback what Alessandra said, because one of the things, I think it's important to sit in the discomfort actually, because it really helps us to reflect on us as a person and what things, at least I'm talking especially from my conflict engagement lens. I asked my students to write about how that landed for them and their experiences, because I believe knowing self in that way will help them, you know? So I don't know if I'm answering the question the way the way you put it out there, but I think it's important to sit in the discomfort and not push back about like, well, I'll say this, not say, well, I didn't feel safe. I kind of lead, at least in my engagements with my class, the idea that things definitely are going to come up and they are going to hit a certain way, but that's why we'll talk about them. And we may not talk about them in a bigger group, but we will make space to talk about them one-on-one so we can get to why this was uneasy for you, you know? Because I really do believe I believe in self-reflection or reflection and how it can help build you as a person, but also sometimes your educational journey. Pass.
Yeah, no, thank you both for that. I appreciated hearing that, and that I think it gives us something all to think about. And I think when we're in the classroom and conversations come up, not allowing things to be directed personally, and like you said earlier, Scott, like using I statements. And I know there are some people who are of the school of thought that there should be trigger warnings in almost every single conversation. So I think at the beginning of the semester, letting people know what the course material will be. And there are things like that may be personal to people, that we have a history tied to some of these conversations or discussions, and different things are going to come up for different people. And we have to have these conversations, and trying to do it in a place that makes people as comfortable as possible and sitting with the discomfort.
One other quick question with regard to, and I think Sky, you mentioned this. So I utilize and do, restorative models, and I teach virtually, and just wondered thoughts about doing the restorative circle, with the large groups and virtually, just tips or suggestions or what you find to be effective.
Believe it or not, I think I mentioned it earlier, but breakouts, believe it or not, like setting us up in the setting of us all, being in the bigger room, but giving those little opportunities, even when I've even done restorative conflict facilitations on Zoom, obviously, because we're in a Zoom age. And it goes better than I thought it would, even with tension and high, like, opposing views, but giving the opportunity for people to kind of step back or breaking out, if you know what I mean, so that one person can talk to someone else, however you've constructed, your class, I am finding is really helpful. And I can only speak to this for the last 2 years. Whether it's a conflict situation or a class situation, the students really seem to feel supported. I never really intentionally put a one student with this student, but it just kind of organically, serendipitously works out where, oh, well, we didn't agree on that, but it was interesting to hear their view on it. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah, and I think my question, so I agree with that. And my question relates also to the idea of having one large circle versus the smaller breakout. So I absolutely agree when you go into the breakout, but I guess there's a concern I always have about everyone not being able to hear everyone, which may be silly, but like that there's something about like everyone being able to hear everyone, not just the utility of, being able to be heard in a small group.
Well, I do have a very small tip, not to sound cheesy, but another restorative practitioner said this to me, and it does seem setting like 15 minutes or 10 minutes to really get to everyone's values for real. And I don't know, values, and besides guidelines, but guidelines are important. That does, even with people who've never met each other, seriously, that does seem to kind of create, again, that little community in that virtual space. And if we do spend that little bit of time, even when things are going to arise, people start to kind of, especially if you're going to see a group more than once, like a class, right? That really is helpful. That's my only tip, sorry.
And I know it's hard when we don't see everyone's faces too, and they're
Yes,
not reacting.
absolutely.
Just using the chat,
Yes.
it makes it challenging.
Amen, amen, amen. We are running over, and I'm so sorry and so grateful